All right, everyone, welcome. Good evening. We are here in our webinar series for Coach Beyond, a really amazing conversation tonight called Coaching Through Crisis, sort of the next conversation on mental health and sport. I am joined with some amazing guests tonight that I'm going to intro in just a moment. But as many of you know, I am Dr. Samantha Bates, and I'm a professor in the College of Social Work at Ohio State, a part of this Coach Beyond initiative, which is a partnership between Life Sports and the Ohio High School Athletic Association. Thus far, we have trained over 8,000 coaches through our webinars, our resources, and our in-person and online trainings. And we're really excited for tonight to become a resource for all of the coaches in Ohio and beyond. So just to get us going, Q Banks will be back next time. Don't worry. But this is our game plan for tonight. We're going to kind of high level talk about how coaches can respond to crises and really navigate some experiences associated with grief and loss. We're also going to reflect on the ways to respond and address a loss in a school community or even an athletic team. As many of you as coaches, athletic directors know, the sport ecosystem is not immune to these types of crises. So how can we respond? We have some national experts tonight who are going to share with us some techniques and maybe strategies, just things to get this on our awareness about how we as coaches can respond to a crisis. But here's why we're here tonight. And I have the amazing Tony Dixon on with us, who can probably speak to this, and he's going to share more. But we did a national coach survey, Dawn Anderson Butcher and I here in Ohio, and have shared these results nationally. And about half of all coaches want more training or are interested in training around suicide protocols, whether that's prevention, referral, or even after a community has experienced a loss. And so that's really why we're here tonight. And that's why I have invited these three incredible guests. So I'm going to start first with welcoming Dr. John Ackerman, who is a clinical psychologist and suicide prevention clinical manager for the Center for Suicide Prevention and Research at Nationwide Children's Hospital here in Columbus, Ohio. This center is nationally recognized and supports school, healthcare, and youth-serving organizations on implementing effective and sustainable suicide prevention programming efforts. Since 2015, John has been a part of leading broader efforts, as many of you may know, of signs of suicide in central and southeastern Ohio. And Dr. Ackerman has also developed suicide prevention programming for Boys and Girls Clubs of America. He is faculty with the Zero Suicide Institute and focuses on training organizations to promote evidence-based suicide care. And he believes that all of us, including coaches, have a role to play in suicide prevention. So John, welcome. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Next up is Coach Dixon. We were just singing his praises. This is the head basketball coach at Dayton Dunbar High School, or otherwise Paul Lawrence Dunbar High School. Tony, as Anthony goes by, Dixon Jr., has worked in education for 10 plus years, a true champion in our schools, and is currently the administrative assistant of school culture at Horizon Science Academy in Dayton High School. He has been coaching boys basketball for 11 years. Shout out to the team. They're going to be scrappy. We just heard this year. And this is going to be his fourth year as the head basketball coach at his alma mater, Dunbar High School. He says, and this is his quote, "Serving the youth in the community is my calling, and it means the world to me." So, Tony, thank you for being here tonight.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. All right. And last up is Dr. Sharon Hoover, a licensed clinical psychologist and professor at the University of Maryland School of Medicine, Division of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry. She is the co-director of the National Center for School Mental Health and director of the National Center for Safe and Supportive Schools. She's currently leading national efforts to support states, districts, and schools in adopting national performance standards of comprehensive school mental health systems. A huge endeavor, Dr. Hoover. And this is a part of her clinical research and educational work, and has for 2 decades been in partnership with the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, the U.S. Department of Education, and the World Health Organization to train behavioral health leaders and professionals in addressing the mental health crisis. So thank you, Dr. Sharon Hoover, for being with us tonight.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, what a great lineup. Okay, so knowing that each of you, I just read your bio, but I'm going to start with each of you, and I'm going to actually kick it off with John, and then we'll go around. So John, tell us a little bit more about your role at Nationwide Children's, your background, and then I really want to hear your why. Why did you get involved in this work?
Sounds great. So as you mentioned, I'm a psychologist and suicide prevention clinical manager at Nationwide Children's Hospital, and I've been doing all that work for over 15 years now. I am also a former mid-level sports participant and current rec softball coach and dance dad. So I've got a few different hats that I'm bringing to this table today. And I'll kind of you had mentioned a lot of the work that we do, and really we just want to identify gaps where youth suicide risk is high, where kids' needs aren't being met, supporting families in this really difficult topic, and providing tools, practical tools that folks can use, because like I said, suicide prevention is really something we can all be part of. And I think it's realistic, even though we're dealing with some escalating mental health crises in this country, we can definitely all have a role. My why is a combination of things. I've had family, friends impacted by suicide loss, and in the work that I do, it's unfortunately something that we do encounter. And I've learned so much about families who have, wonderful, amazing humans who have experienced critical losses that we really want to do anything in our power to avoid. So, as a psychologist, I've always tried to find ways to help people in need. I got involved with doing suicide research over a decade ago, and have just really continued to see that by giving people the tools prior to a crisis and knowing how to confidently handle these difficult situations, not only are we preparing trusted adults to play a bigger role in the lives of kids, but we really are saving lives. I could run through thousands of stories at this point to see that. So my why is let's make the world a safer place and a healthier place for our kids.
Yeah, love that. So shout out to the dance dads out there too. They recognize, and also let's make it a safer place. And your research and work has been dedicated to that. All right, Tony, tell us just a little more about you and your why, and then we'll go over to Dr. Hoover.
I'm actually a dance and cheer dad.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There you go.
I have two daughters, beautiful wife. I grew up here in Dayton, Ohio. I was actually working a job I didn't want to work at. And a buddy of mine had a job for me at the Salvation Army, and he gave me a third grade group of boys. And beginning of the year, it was kind of like, I don't know. And then towards, Christmas, January, we start getting better. I'm like, I can do this. And it made me a kid again. I was living through these kids by giving back to them. And it just brought me so much joy. And at the time I was like 21, 22, so I didn't have any kids. So it was just me trying to figure it out. And the kids kind of changed my way of thinking, the way I move, my way of life. So it was just something I just fell in love with and been doing it ever since.
I can feel it from you. What a sense of meaning and purpose through young people to give back to your community, and then also feel like, I love when you said, I felt like a kid again. It's like that joy just comes back in coaching and being involved and empowering young people. So
right.
To know your why, I can feel the coach in there. Yeah. Sharon, what about you? What's your why? A little bit more about you.
Sure. I loved hearing the joy part as well. It's always great to hear a coach who's interacting every day with our young people saying that they feel joyful doing that. So it's awesome. So a little bit about me. I'm a clinical psychologist, and I spent a lot of my time in different mental health settings in hospitals and outpatient, inpatient. And then I started working in schools about 20 years ago and never turned back. I really have felt like if we want to support students' mental health, that schools are one of the most important places that we can do that. So I did spend a number of years doing direct clinical work in schools, and then have done a fair amount of research and policy work also. And for about 15 years now, have been co-director of the National Center for School Mental Health that you mentioned earlier. And so we spent a lot of our time doing training and technical assistance and research and policy work to support mental health integration into schools, so that we can make schools a safe and supportive place for young people, and so that we can support the adults who are trying to teach and coach and support our young people's well-being and learning every day. So it's really a privilege to do the work that I've been able to do. And a little bit about my why. So I always knew I wanted to either go into teaching or psychology or mental health. I ended up going down the mental health path, but ended up gravitating towards schools anyhow. I'm convinced, as I said earlier, that if we're going to support young people's mental health, we have to go to where they are in the school setting, on the playing fields, and, in their homes, and not just kind of sit in mental health clinics waiting for things to, kind of blow up or go to crisis point. And then, on a more personal note related to tonight's topic, I'm a mom also. We didn't realize we had this connection of dance moms, but I am a dance mom. I have 3 young people, all adolescents. So I have 2 high school students as kids and 1 college student. All 3 are athletes. 1 is a dancer and captain of our Palms team. So, the sports world is a place where I think students get so much of their mental health and well-being support. And coaches have a big responsibility in that role as well. And my son's, cross country team lost 2 students during his senior year, 1 to suicide and 1 to a motor vehicle accident. And so, I saw firsthand how devastating, of course, those losses were to families, but also to the teammates and to the coaches. And so, if there's any forum for supporting coaches in this really important role, I'm in. So I thank you for doing this work tonight.
Nice. We were going to find some common ground. I didn't know it would be the dance,
the dance parent
here. Well, we know we also have other things in common. And Sharon, thanks for sharing your why. I could certainly feel that. And, Tony, I really spoke with you and just am so grateful that you're here, because your experience is actually one we've been hearing across the state, which is, hey, I might need to know more, or we need to be having this conversation. And so, Tony, I'm actually going to kind of start with you, because the title of our webinar tonight is Coaching Through Crisis. Would you tell us a little bit about your experience as a coach, just to kind of frame tonight why we're having this conversation, because it's one we've heard from others.
Yeah, so I had a kid that for us as coaches he was a joy to be around. And the week leading up to, he kind of got like a common cold. We kind of checked in on him. And that weekend, he had 2 really good games for us. He was a sophomore. And that Monday, I got a text, random, just, his name was Deviante. He said, have you heard from Day-Day? I'm like, no. So, of course, the coach instinct, I get the calling around. And I heard that he had possibly harmed himself. So I was at work. I don't work in the building. So I rushed right over to Dunbar. And on my way there, in my mind, I was just like, what could I have done? I was just overthinking. But then it came back to the 4 core values that I have been instilling into the young men was loyalty, integrity, faith, and toughness. And I felt like our faith and mental toughness was being leaned on. And I all I could think was, God put me in this position to lead these young men. And when I got to the school, it was rough. It was rough. So I really didn't know what to do. Never dealt with this. We had a nice outpour of support with the building administration, athletic administration, and our downtown building. It was just, it was surreal. And the kids decided to play the next day. We went out and played Urbana. It was one of the hardest things I've ever had to deal with, ever. And we won the game. It was very, very emotional, but just leaning on our core values, the faith part was really what kept me going. I felt like I was being tested somewhere, and all I could think of was our faith was being tested. And we was really big that year on communication, not with just on the basketball court, but in life. Just communicate. We're here to help you. So we was able to touch on that a lot and created a bond within the team after that situation.
Yeah. Well, and Tony, just, as framing again for Ohio, we know 70% of coaches are not educators in the building. So you are an educator, but like you said, you weren't in the building. And
Right.
so I'm just, putting myself in your shoes and thinking I'm driving over there as someone who's not in the school building. And how am I going to address our team? How are we going to move forward? Do we play? Do we not play the next game? Just a lot of those questions. But I did
Mhm.
hear you say some helpful things of we have these core values, and I'm going to lean into those and emulate some of them for this young man. But, John and Sharon, as we hear Tony's story, this is one that's pretty common. A coach is, the supportive adult in the community, but then there are these, what could I have done? So John, this prevention. And then Sharon, maybe we can talk a little bit about, grief and loss. But John, I would start with you. What are some of the best practices as you think about prevention that we can share out with coaches like Tony, who have these amazing relationships with our young people in our schools and communities?
Yeah, I'm going to build right off of what Tony already talked about, what he was doing, which is focusing on communication and creating spaces where if a young person is struggling, they know that it doesn't have to be some specific protocol or some magic response. Going to a person who they trust and making sure, if you're part of a school community, make sure those trusted adults are prepared for how to navigate those conversations, which are not easy. I will tell you, from a sort of a mental health provider standpoint, we need really a lot of training to do that work well. So putting adults who are the natural outlets for kids into places where they can feel confident and ready to move forward with these tough conversations, which may start by just listening to the struggles that a person's going through. That you as a coach, I think, sometimes can be hard because you want to fix it, you want to make the play right, you want to make sure you've got a game plan that goes a lot. You do have a general game plan of helping a person navigate a crisis, but a lot of it starts with just being there, just being present. One of the most poignant experiences that I've had doing some of the work in crisis support is a baseball coach. Right after we had done a training, he went from being very unsure about what to do to just sitting with a player for well longer than he thought he would have done before, and listening, and then not being too overwhelmed in terms of being able to ask direct questions like, have you been thinking about harming yourself? Have you ever thought about ending your life? These are very concrete ways that we want to try to empower trusted adults like coaches to do that. So coaches actually play a really important role in shaping the lives of kids, and they have these certain they have authority, and they have the ability to help be part of that young person's dreams, whether it's helping them become what they want to be, putting them in roles that they can really be successful. And so they build in this trust. And some of the research actually shows coaches are even more comfortable folks to talk to than a therapist. So coaches have this natural ability to connect and to, even if it's not everything is about the crisis itself, just to be present and give them a space. So that's what I'd say is important. And it sounds like you do that, Tony. So thank you for your work.
Yeah, I can't imagine. Tony's team would be somewhere to be, right? It would be the place you want to be and connected with him. And, as I heard you say, John, though, that one of the important things is kind of getting comfortable in the discomfort of asking some of those hard questions. And, I'm the daughter of a football coach, and sometimes he'll say to me, I need somebody to tell me the exact right question to ask. And so, John, I think one of the things that I'm hearing you say is coaches getting trained in mental health, which is now a mandate in Ohio, sitting and practicing asking the question, are you having thoughts of suicide? Are you having thoughts of hurting yourself? And kind of making that an open conversation and being able to meet students where they are and help them, have space to just figure out what's going on. Tony, I didn't know if you had anything else to add there.
Yeah. And what's crazy about it is the day before he had came into practice, because we practice on a Sunday, and I'm letting the rims down and I can hear him behind me. And I'm like, he was down and out most of the week from, the common cold, which we thought was, nothing. But I hear him in the background. I said, we got Day back, y'all. He's back. And he's playful, joyful. And then that struck. And it was just like, like he said, for me now thinking on it, it's like, okay, if they are going through something, have a conversation. Maybe it's not small, maybe it's big. And that's the tough questions. And a lot of kids will, if you ask them how you doing, they're gonna always say good.
Yeah.
So you got to kind of get it out of them and create that space. So that was big. I appreciate that.
Oh yeah.
Can I add one thing, Sam?
Yeah, go for it.
Just one of the things that I think it's a tough balance because even though we talk a lot about looking for warning signs and paying attention to these things, suicide is not this wonderfully predictable tragedy. It is very hard, and we know that kids have a lot of incentive to sort of mask what they're going through at times. So we want to give them the space to share. But for those of you who are on the webinar, or Tony, and anyone who's lost someone and has felt maybe, what if I paid attention to this? It's really important that why is a really, really hard question. And the ability to predict that or say that, oh, because that person was going through a hard time, I should have known that, is not something from like that grief perspective that ends up being the most helpful question. The most helpful question is, what did that person mean to us? How do we move forward? So I won't steal the next set of questions, but I did want to highlight that. As someone who works in suicide prevention all the time, I wish it were even more predictable than it is, because then we could get that help immediately. But unfortunately, it ends up being a perfect storm of some negative events. When we see the warning signs, let's absolutely react and ask those questions and respond. But it is still a challenging thing to do.
I love that. You said, our new question now is, how do we want to make meaning? What did that person mean to us? How can we, continue to move forward? And I think that's really important. And Tony, I see you nodding if that's really helpful. I want to get to Sharon, because I know you've been doing this work in schools and in partnership with communities. And, here is a coach and a team who's experienced a loss. What are some of your recommendations for how we answer that question of what John just asked? How do we respond after a loss?
Yeah, and I'm going to kind of talk about it in two ways. First is just like some of those basic communication strategies that we are often at a loss for when we've experienced a loss, right? And I'm going to share a couple of resources. Maybe I'll throw them in the chat. But one, speaks to exactly what Tony and John were talking about in terms of just being available for listening and connecting with students. So that's super important when it comes to prevention work, but also when it comes to response, right? So just being open, listening to what students have to say, what emotions they're expressing following a loss, right? But also, you already have the relationships as coaches with students. And so that connection is really critical to maintain and recognize the importance of in supporting students. I love, Tony, that you said, so I knew it was my role. I was blessed to be here to support the young man who had been impacted. So coaches play this huge role. And I'll go ahead and share one of my favorite resources that really it's general to school crises across the board, but certainly very relevant in the context of loss of a student or even loss of a teacher, another adult or community member. And it just goes through 5 areas with really specific. I love how you said, Sam, my dad as a football coach said, well, just give me those things to say. So this is kind of a workbook. Like, here's a few things to say in the context of a crisis. How do I listen? What do I actually say? How do I protect? How do I connect? How do I model? How do I teach? Those are the 5 things. And it walks through that. So those are just some of the kind of very general, you got to be there to listen, you got to connect, you want to support young people in getting back into their rituals and routines to kind of normalize their experience. And there's what we often call in the suicide intervention and prevention field, postvention, right? And so folks working in schools may have heard that term before, but it's really important that schools have what's called a postvention plan. And that's really an organized response in the aftermath of a suicide to accomplish a few different things. One is to facilitate healing, right, of all those who are impacted. And another is really to mitigate against any of the other negative impacts that may come about from exposure to suicide. So we know that, young people and those who are directly impacted by loss related to suicide may be at greater risk of harming themselves or of suicide. And so it's really important that we put pieces in place, that we put actual strategies in place to mitigate against those. There's some really clear best practices to do that. Part of it is making sure you have a safe media plan, right? So that you're working with the media to message appropriately and safely. And I'll put some of the resources in there around that. Some of it, traditionally, there was kind of a model where we waited for folks to come to us to seek support if they were struggling. And the field has really shifted to have, what some call survivor outreach teams, where you are actively going out and connecting with the young people and the adults who are most directly impacted by a loss to ensure that you're checking in with them. And again, coaches are such a critical part of that outreach, right? So, and not just saying, how are you doing? Because I know having 3 teenagers, what's the typical response to that? I'm fine, right? So, having some of those questions and supporting our coaches and our teachers with those questions. Are you struggling today? What are, on a scale of 1 to 10, how are you feeling today, right? There's different ways of asking how are you doing that might get a little bit more nuanced. And then certainly if you're worried about somebody's risk, being very direct with the questions about self-harm and potential for suicide. So those are some of the things, but having that comprehensive postvention plan is really important. And there's some clear guidance on how to do that, that a lot of schools have already a good plan in place, but it may be worth revisiting. And if your school system doesn't have that plan, or if you haven't really shared it with your coaches and they don't know what their role is there, it's important for them to understand their role in the postvention.
Yeah, that's some great resources. I'm looking and seeing the model, connect, protect, and I'm thinking about Tony, how it was, I got to get there and I got to model the faith and the mental toughness and our values, and I got to stay connected, and then I got to protect and make sure that the rest of my team continues to feel safe. I mean, Tony, is there something as you look back that you're like, I did this and it felt really meaningful as a coach who was, coaching through crisis, that you did to show up for your athletes that you want to share?
I think really it was just being a leader and creating that bond. I think we came together closer than we've ever been as a unit. Some of those guys, I had 4 or 5 seniors on that team. We had kids. We even had some freshmen. So I think for me, it was just us coming together as one unit. And it helped that we actually went into the Sweet 16 in the state tournament, because this happened right after our last game of the season. And it gave us something more to play for.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? I always preach, you have to play for each other. Like, I always wrote that on the board. And that kind of stood out because we were playing for each other at that moment. So that really stood out for me.
I really love that. As I'm putting all of your pieces together, one of the questions that's coming to mind is this postvention plan for the sports season. So we've got it for the school. And then, as Tony said, I had to go play the next game. And then we had to continue to say, what does this person mean to us? How are we going to make meaning? But thinking about that really interestingly from kind of grief and loss and planning for the sports season of a student athlete who's been lost on that team. And Tony, it sounds like I can't, to Sharon's resource model, connect, protect, that it feels really true to kind of the way that you showed up for your student athletes. One of the things that has also been brought up among coaches across our state, and John, I'm going to kind of come back to you, is coaches also sometimes don't feel equipped necessarily to help that student athlete who is receiving mental health services, and understanding how much to be involved, how they can show up and support. So I'm going to ask you to kind of speak to that, because I think coaches feel a little bit like they're walking on eggshells, unsure. They know they want to support, but they're not sure how much and how to do it. Could you speak to that a bit?
Sure. I think there's probably a little bit difference between ongoing emotional challenges versus knowing what the student athlete's treatment is looking like, because one is a sort of a legal and ethical issue where you really aren't privy to the information of a a student's mental health care unless you happen to be someone that the family has, consented to receive information. Now, it could be if there's a great relationship going on and the young person has identified you as a safe and trusted adult, and the family and the young person do want you as part of their safety network, that could be something that's consented to. But for the most part, I think it's about being emotionally in tune to what's going on within the athletic context, to know that your role can be a massive protective factor, that you are providing, as Sharon said before, the structure, the routine, the sense of meaning, the sense of hope, all these things which are super protective, while also understanding that if this was a teammate who was lost, if this was someone, within the school context or a friend, it's also could be a constant reminder of that loss and grief at the same time. So I think as a coach, what you can do in any circumstances, knowing that there's been a loss, is do regular emotional check-ins. Say, understand and create the expectation, starting with yourself. Model that this is hard. This is not easy. That no one's going to grieve the same way. There's going to be some ups and downs. You may be good to go, and not need to dig deep into this, or you might be someone who needs to really seek out support. And no matter what you decide to do, we are fully behind you, and you are strong and brave for tackling one of these biggest issues, which you didn't ask for. You didn't want this to be part of your season. So just, I think, acknowledging all those pieces, knowing that some pieces which you can't necessarily predict, you didn't know that, when the other guy, stole the ball and dunked on you, that was their signature move, and that brought to get out some particular memory, or those experiences, or they're just someone just throws the ball a certain way, or just kicks their glove over here. It just, those little things could be big reminders. So there's no right or wrong. So I think it's just about being available, checking in, and making sure it's really intentional that you're doing that. It's not just like at the end of the season or some anniversary. It's just you're checking in throughout the time and giving them that space.
I think you bring up two really nice things I want to highlight. The first is, for coaches, it's important to understand confidentiality of mental health providers. And, I kind of love how Gene Smith, the athletic director at Ohio State, talks about it, where he says, a coach is in your circle of care. So you may have your athletic trainer who tapes up your ankle. You may have your mental health therapist, right, who's working through some of those mental health treatment. And then you've got your coach who's a part of that circle of care. And it may not be that you know every detail of what's happening in the circle of care, but everyone's sort of checking in across the board, right? Because that mental health therapist is saying, how are things with your coach? And that athletic trainer, right, is also saying, let's get the plan ready for coach for you to go back. And so I think as we first think about it, it's okay to not know it all, but see yourself as a part of that young person's circle of care. And then the second part that you really touched on of just grief is not linear, right? It is not something that there's this and then there's that, and then all of a sudden you're going to feel better. I mean, Tony, you're nodding. It probably comes up in your school community for your team, for you often, and just not letting that happen and giving emotional time and space. Would that be true, Tony? I saw you nodding. You're just the grief coming up.
That's so true. For me, it just triggered me to have those 15 minutes before practice. Right after that happened, just talk to the kids, tell them about my day. How are you doing? It's crazy because we was always talking about communication, and one thing I wanted to do more of was one-on-one, getting to know the kids. So what he was saying just it hit home, because I literally that triggered me, and I was like, every day before practice, I'm gonna sit the whole team down. We're gonna talk. If I got something going on or I'm feeling some type of way, I'm gonna let it out, just to try to bridge that gap, because we were having a hard time getting them to communicate all the time, just on the court. But we were trying to use that as a life tool. Like, you have to communicate in life. You own your own business. You work for someone. You have to communicate. So that was some good things to hear him saying that, because that's the only thing I can come up with. I'm like, man, I have to talk to him some kind of way. I can't go through this again. So I've tried anything. So yeah, I like to hear that.
Tony, you were obviously so responsive and just knowing I have to create that space. And I love that you said this because this is kind of where we're heading. You were vulnerable, right? And you knew you were also coping with a loss. And so I'm going to come back to kind of you and Sharon here. But, Sharon, we also have adults, right? These coaches who Tony just sat on here and said, my mission in life is to give back to my community. I feel like I'm playing, I'm joyful when I'm back with these young people. And knowing Tony, when we spoke on the phone, I was almost brought to tears of your experience of the loss. And so, Sharon, I would ask you, as we think about those in schools, these coaches who are giving their time and energy and love to these young people, any best practices or recommendations you can offer for how we can support coaches who might be experiencing a loss?
Yeah, I mean, one of the main messages we give to coaches, to teachers who, roll up their sleeves and their first priority is helping their students, right, and their students' families. And sometimes they don't take care of themselves. So our first message is give yourself grace, right? Give yourself grace to take time to take care of yourself and allow your own grieving process, right? So oftentimes, again, we kind of put our blinders on as parents, as coaches, as helpers, helping professionals, and we're not really paying attention to what's happening within us. But Tony had a significant loss also, right? It was his student also. And so while he's taking care of his players, this is, also his loss. So allowing your time to grieve. And part of that is understanding the grieving process. So one of the ways that school communities and the mental health field can help coaches and others who may experience loss is really helping them understand what is the grief process, right? It's not a linear process, as you said, but there are some things that we can expect, right? A lot of people go through denial and isolation at first. They then go through anger and frustration, right? There are some kind of common stages, not linear, but some common themes that we see. And sometimes when you are going through grieving, it can be really helpful to know that that's normal, right? You're not out of the norm here. You're not losing your mind. Things often do get better, but it's a process. And just to know that can be really helpful, right? We go through the bargaining process. People talk about the 5 stages of grief. Some people talk about the 7 stages of grief. But there are some common things that we can let people know when they've gone through a loss, that these are some things you might expect, right? And there's significant sadness that comes usually around that 4th stage of grief. And then what some people call acceptance. But a piece of the education is really working with coaches, families to know that acceptance doesn't mean forgetting, right? It just means a bit more coming to terms with that loss, although the grief can last a lifetime, right? So what does that balance look like between accepting and grieving for a lifetime? The other thing we can do with coaches is really encourage them to seek help in whatever way makes sense for them, right? And to make, accommodations in the school environment or on the playing field for coaches who may be grieving, right? So making sure that they know how to access mental health professionals if needed, making sure they understand in their faith community how they can get help. So there's lots of ways people want to get help, but they might not necessarily know how to access it. And so there's tasks of mourning that we talk about, kind of tasks of the grief process that oftentimes a helping professional can really help with, right? Because people who are experiencing a sudden loss especially often feel completely lost themselves as to how do I cope with this grieving. So mental health professionals can often help with that. So those are some of the things that we can do as a community to help our coaches.
Yeah, I love that you said that because there are these stages of grief that we can say, a day of anger, when whatever John was kind of mentioning, that trigger or what may happen, this may be what we may experience, both helpful for the adult coach and then also the coach working with the young people to know, okay, so-and-so teammate has showed up. There's some anger today or some bargaining happening. And now I know this is a part of the grief process and let me make sure to check in. I love also, I think we had Mike Vrabel on from the Tennessee Titans who said, I go talk to somebody every once in a while, and I need to make sure I create that space for myself because I'm such a helper. I'm such a coach to everybody, but who's kind of coaching me up or helping me reflect through what I need to be working on and getting better. So certainly some good avenues. Yeah.
One quick thing I wanted to add is to normalize, but also really support coaches through survivor guilt. So to really name it and to say to coaches, to teachers, to parents, families, very commonly experience survivor guilt. If I had only done that, and I know we've already touched on that, but it's a really important part of supporting our coaches, letting them know that this wasn't their fault. That, as John said, suicide is not a perfectly predictable event. And so we always, question and look back. That's part of what a lot of people do, including those in that inner circle. So just naming that and supporting coaches through it is really important.
Yeah, really naming the survivor guilt. Tony, I know we wanted to get your perspective because you are a coach who has coached through crisis. What worked for you and continues to work for you as you navigate the loss in your school community?
One counselor told me during this process, she said it's okay not to be okay. And like you guys were saying, I want to help. I wanted to, show strength. I wanted to show the toughness. And when she said that, I kind of, teared up because I wasn't okay. Tearing up now, but it was just difficult. And when I heard it, it was just for me. I needed a release, and I kind of leaned on my two girls and my wife, just, being grateful, coming home to them every day. So that was really, really big for me. So, excuse me. So yeah, that's what kind of helped me through it.
Yeah. Making sure you're grateful and your family and spending time. I also think, just expressing your emotions like you're doing and saying that young person meant so much to me. How great to share your story tonight too, so that you can help other coaches, right, who may experience a loss or simply just want to start to think about this, to our points of how do I get prepared? How do I get ready? But Tony, we appreciate you sharing.
Yeah, I appreciate Tony, and I think I bet your kids know how much you care about them, and just by openly sharing that this is hard, I hope more coaches take your lead and show that toughness is not about like bottling up every normal, natural human emotion, especially when a young person has died that you cared about. And I mean, I think it will make a huge difference if more kids see that the coaches care deeply and are able to share that. So I know it's hard, but thank you for sharing.
Yeah. I want to ask all of you, as we're coming to time here, if there's anything else you want to share, Tony, your experience truly moving all of us as we think about, your school community in Dayton and your basketball team and your leadership on this webinar. I mean, you and other coaches across the state are the reason we're having this conversation, is to share it out. But what else, if anything, do we want to talk about as it comes to coaching through crisis? What have we missed? What feels really important here?
For me as a coach, I'm intense. I'm intense, but I also show love, so they understand me. But also, going through that situation kind of helped me look at things just a little different. Maybe me getting on them and showing them love, maybe they need just a little bit more love, or maybe if what really triggered was watching them in practice. If they're really struggling, instead of, talking to them about practice, pull them to the side and talk about something totally different from basketball. And I think that was, for us as a staff, we kind of, our eyes was open. It was just a shock factor throughout the whole community. So our eyes was open. So for me, I wanted to be more intentional with not necessarily if the kid was struggling here, struggling there, pull them to the side and bring up something totally different from basketball. So I think that's important.
I love that. I think you emulate, our message as a team of Coach Beyond is beyond the X's and O's. So that practice when, we're trying to get that play and you see that young person struggling and there's stuff going on off the field or the court or the mat, right? It's being intentional, to your words, and having the conversation because it's so needed, right? And the coach, again, is a part of that circle in that child's life, and you could be the reason that they're able to express something else going on. I love that.
Yeah, so a couple of just closing thoughts. I mean, one is at a community level, we often talk about mental health being a team sport, right? We can't just rely on our mental health specialists. We have to think about every adult and young person, peers, as part of that mental health team. And I think communities often underestimate the importance of coaches as mental health supports for our young people. So just urging communities to really value their coaches as mental health supports, and train and equip and support your coaches. And then to coaches, I think just one message is, when you do experience a loss, when you do experience the loss of a student to suicide in particular, it is a defining moment in your life and career. But also to keep in mind that it's not the defining moment. It's not your legacy. Your legacy really is made up of all of the lives you've connected with, and all the lives that you have likely saved without even knowing it. And just that day-to-day support you provide to your students, how critical that is for their mental health. So just to keep that in mind as coaches who've gone through loss.
Yeah, I love that. So valuing at the community level, training and equipping our coaches, but also coaches not defining a loss as one of the reasons, or doing that, something else. It's really saying, what are all the other impacts and ripple effects that I've had in this community that are positive? And for thinking about being in education for 11 years, like Tony, and head basketball coach for 4, there's, hundreds of young people who, by his leadership, who then go out and lead, who then make the community better. And so thinking about those ripple effects. John, to you for a final sentiment.
Yeah, it's I can't top those two, but I will say I love the idea that mental health is a team sport. I like the openness and realizing you can connect with lots of kids. I would also highlight that athletes do have a somewhat different mindset in some ways, meaning they have been taught in many cases that I can work my way out of this. I can work harder. I can push myself. I can get this done if only I put in more effort. And mental health doesn't always work like that. You need to sometimes step back. You need to sometimes get help, rely on the people around you. So I think deprogramming ourselves a little bit in that way of knowing, like, it's not always about like just stretching yourself even more thin. Sometimes it's getting that support, and then realizing that coaches could be in a spot to see some of those warning signs, like changes in sleep or diet or energy or caring about things that they normally do. So some of those things are the ways that you can be part of that mental health team that Sharon was talking about. So, and I'll just end by saying it's been an honor to be part of this group and have part of this discussion that hopefully is just beginning.
Yeah, I keep losing my words because I'm so moved, and I'm like, okay, keep going with the webinar, Sam. Like, whoo. Okay, so I am now going to open it up to questions from our amazing audience, because we have some folks here who may want to, get your perspective. So Sid, tell us what's coming through the chat that folks would like to ask our amazing panelists.
Yeah, I think one question that we've got is just, we spoke a little bit about asking the questions, what questions to ask. And then I think, John, you mentioned, like, sometimes it's unpredictable, but what are some things, like, how do you know when to ask these types of questions to your student athletes, or when would you know to maybe check in a little deeper with 1 or 2 of your athletes?
So is that to me? I can start.
I mean,
so,
you can start, and then we'll bounce around to
there'll
everyone
be
can answer.
plenty of
But
expertise on this call. Absolutely. So I'll kind of answer that in 2 parts. Part 1 is don't wait for warning signs, and don't wait to see something. A lot of people think of suicide prevention as like a program that you have in middle or high school or college, and really I think suicide prevention is a developmental process. It starts by helping young kids label their emotions, know how to communicate what's going on when things are tough. And so actually those coaches of very young kids can help with prevention and managing a crisis by helping kids understand and how to talk about big emotions and tough emotions, and going all the way up to what are these warning signs that what we're looking for? What are these distressing factors when a person starts to feel hopeless or like a burden, and feeling like the things that they do don't matter anymore, or specifically in sports, if you define yourself as an athlete and you're no longer able to do the things that you were able to do, or you wanted to make this team and you didn't make it, these are all things to pay attention to. And then can you remind me of the second part of that question? Sorry, I went off in a little bit.
I think you got it. It was just knowing when to ask. I think that was it.
That when you see those warnings, like, don't hesitate to ask. And then Sharon mentioned this before. There's actually a number of studies out there that show if you ask a person, have they had thoughts of ending their life or killing themselves, you are not putting that idea into their mind. You do want to have in your mind, before you ask these questions, who can I turn to? Who's part of my pathway for support if a person says yes? Because what you don't want to do is say, you're not thinking about hurting yourself, are you? And then don't give them space. You got to intentionally give them space to say yes to that question. Yes, it's been really hard, and sometimes I don't want to be here. And then knowing how to move forward with that. So we've worked with thousands of kids, and it's relieving for them to know that a trusted adult is willing to sit with them and respond. So that in itself is just this major opportunity for a young person who's might have been hiding and ashamed of this feeling, even though it's nothing to be ashamed about.
Yeah, and I think just being, open about asking, what are your stressors this week? What are things you're worried about? What are, the challenges? I mean, just finding different ways of asking the question again, instead of just how you doing? And I love the idea of redefining mental toughness, to also include being open to talking about your challenges and the difficulties that you're experiencing amongst your teammates, amongst your peers, because that's often considered a sign of weakness in, what we might think of as outdated models of mental toughness, right? So I think Tony's modeling this vulnerability as being, tough, right? It's hard to do that work. And so to model that for your athletes is incredibly powerful.
I love that. I heard y'all saying, one, don't wait to ask, which I think is great. Like, go ahead and be checking in on athletes well ahead of time, asking what their stressors are, what's going on that week. Is it midterms? Is it finals time frame, right? And then really leaning in. We always talk about open-ended questions, right? Ask them, tell me about, what about this, rather than the sort of closed-ended leading questions that don't quite get to what you want them to say. We've got a couple of questions coming in, so I'm going to keep us rolling, but all of our amazing panelists, feel free to jump in anytime. We got a question: is it possible to talk too much about mental health with your athletes as a coach? Do you think it's possible to over talk about mental health with your athletes?
Good one.
Well, I'll put one point in there. Oh, I saw, and Tony just unmuted. So I'm going to give the floor to Tony in just a quick moment. One thing I'll say, and this applies to therapists, teachers, coaches, you don't want to self-disclose to the point that your students are feeling like they have to take care of you, right? So really, we need to recognize our role. We are the adults in, teaching, coaching, parenting relationship, and it really is incumbent upon us to care for and support our students. So it's okay to talk about your own mental health challenges or concerns. So that question just reminds me of the idea that sometimes it's possible if you go in there every day and you start talking about all your concerns to the point that students don't feel like they can share with you or that they have to take care of you, that's probably not the best practice. Tony, I'll pass it to you.
I don't think it's too much. I just think you have to talk about it enough to let them know that you care and it's serious. And I think for me, it was just to let them know that I'm a safe place for them to come talk. So I don't think it's too much. I think you just got to do it enough to let our athletes know that, we're here, regardless of what they feel like we can't handle, share it. And that's what I kind of did when I just, opened up to them. It was vulnerable to them, cried around them. So I think you just got to do it enough, if that makes sense.
That makes sense to me. I mean, I think the idea is we probably don't even do this remotely close enough to get this work done. So that's probably not the biggest concern. I will say though, they're often coming to sports and school and the classroom to get back into a routine. Some of these kids, we said some kids need more, some need to get back to what they were doing. So if you can create other options or like sort of private moments or other opportunities or spaces before practice or end practice where some kids can come, we've gone to schools and organizations after a loss, and some kids really want that time and they crave that time. So if you're creating space, but it's not mandated, they don't have to grieve in a specific way. I think that's often helpful.
Yeah, I would just add in and say that's a great conversation for a team to have. How often do we want to check in? What would that look like? When is it too much? If we're at the start of the season and we're all, what do we need as a team? And making sure that you do that individually. Did everyone feel comfortable with the decision of where we landed? Because maybe to Tony's point, there's a couple kiddos who are like, I need you to check in one-on-one every day, and kind of tailoring the conversation to the needs of your athletes. Because you may have some who are like, I just need your big check-in every month. That's good for me. I know who to go to, but you may have 3 or 4 kids who you are one of their critical protective factors, and they might need something differently from you. So again, I think it's a great individual conversation and team conversation for coaches to, just as you would, get a pulse on your team's kind of norms and needs of your student athletes. So Sid, let's do one more question and then we'll let everyone get to Monday Night Football here, right?
Absolutely. These are fantastic just responses, and I love just talk about it just enough. Like, that's so great. But I'm going to kind of mesh together two questions that are kind of overlapping as our last question. So it's kind of about we've got the questions, we know what we're looking for. How do you approach an individual that you have a concern about? And maybe how do you approach different kinds of individuals? Like, let's say you have one who's resistant to talking about themselves outside of sport, or ones that are more open. How would you do different approaches based on where athletes are at?
So I'll say a couple quick things. They're great questions. And I love the idea that, some students aren't going to want to talk about things off the court, right? And that's okay. You want to meet students where they are, but also not wait for them to come to you. So creating those natural opportunities, making it talkable, aboutable. So, having it at the opening of the season, right? I'm here to talk about challenges you may be having. I'm going to check in. But still, you never know when a student is going to take you up on that, right? So you may not think a student's comfortable talking to you, and then all of a sudden they do. It looks like my internet connection just went a little unstable, so I'm going to pause and pass it back
for a little bit and then we lost you. So we'll bring it back. I think you were saying something of like, you never know when they're going to need you to check in. So we'd come back to John and Tony. What do you do when you have a student athlete who's maybe resistant to talking about things that could be stressful off the field or court?
I'll go ahead and just say, much like sometimes kids eating, you can set the table and and put food on the plate, but you can't always force them to do something that they're not going to be able to do. But by being there for these people who may appear to be resistant, another way to frame that would be they're not ready to talk in the way that you were hoping they would talk. So they've got their own strategies and process. So trying to understand that, different people have different ways of navigating that, creating, again, that space and openness to have that conversation, to let them know you're there for them when and if they're ready. And I guess part of it, you may feel like you're not being helpful, but if you say, I'm there for you if and when you need it, you've actually created space. Same thing goes for staff as well. And Sharon mentioned this earlier. Sometimes just saying, I'm willing to think about your schedule and your burdens and your responsibilities right now. Even if you go ahead and do everything that you are normally doing, just knowing that your manager or someone or your administrator is willing to look out for you and know that you've gone through something, that is very empowering. So again, for those young people who might be going through a hard time, kind of leaving that space open for them and finding out, maybe talk to the parents. Maybe there's another trusted adult, another community member. Maybe it's a pastor, a coach, a neighbor, someone else who can, and you can just be part of the system that says, hey, I've noticed these things that are different. I'm concerned. I don't know if it's a big deal or not, but I'd love for someone to check in because I care about them. And if they wanted, please reinforce that I can be a person they'll talk to. But it's there on their timeline. So.
Yeah, I love that. Tony, anything to add? That student athlete that's kind of hard to reach.
Yeah, John, they both touched on it a lot. What's crazy is I try to look at the body language. If I see that something is off, these 14, 15, 16-year-old boys, their body language can be terrible sometimes. So I gotta try to read the body language, and instead of, like he said, not trying to force them to talk, but let them know, like, I'm here if you really need me. I can sense something is going on. That's fine if you don't want to talk, but I'm here. And like going back, like after that situation, I always said it's okay not to be okay. That's totally fine.
Yeah.
Let it out. So
yeah. I love that. So everybody's saying, first of all, kind of roll with the resistance a little bit. It's going to be there. We're always going to have our kiddos who some are more expressive, some are not. But whether it's, your body language, Tony, they're giving off the non-body language and you're just open and there, you're showing that you're willing to listen. And then John and Sharon, to your point, just, hey, that I have an open door policy and I'm here. Some of my biggest breakthroughs with athletes have been picking up the balls after practice. Hey, will you stay back and hang? Because I'm not doing this in front of everybody else. I'm waiting until I have a minute with you. And then I'm going to open my body language and some open-ended questions. And then all of a sudden rolling with the resistance is gone and we're ready. But this has been an incredible panel. So for everyone who's on who would like to submit for a CEU, please go ahead and grab the QR code and Sydney will go ahead and drop this in the chat. Also, if you registered, we can get this to you after if you're a let me do that at work tomorrow kind of person. But we would love to get you some credit for being here tonight. To our amazing and esteemed panel, Tony, Sharon, and John, we cannot say thank you enough for this Monday night conversation. We cannot wait to share this out with all of the coaches and educators across Ohio who are supporting our student athletes, our sports teams, and our communities through sport. So we thank you from Coach Beyond. We will have some upcoming webinars. They are in progress. We're checking with our state team on what we want to hear next across the state. So tune in here in the next couple of months. And thanks again for being with us.